Hello, welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. Hope you guys are doing well. This is part 2 of Gibbo's Corner, and we're talking about the men who nearly became Newcastle United manager. Hopefully, you've watched part 1 and enjoyed it. This is, like I say, part 2 with myself and John Gibson. Some big names we still to talk about, and the important question of all the names that we've spoken about, who is the one John Gibson really hoped would become Newcastle United manager? All that is to come. Let's get on with the show. On to the next name. We're going to fly forward to 1990 or so, and we're going to talk about Graham Taylor, former Aston Villa manager, former England manager, Watford as well, if I'm not mistaken. Just talk to us then about Graham Taylor and the links to Newcastle.
Yeah. This was an interesting one that I think virtually no one knows anything about. What this was at the time when John Hall was taking over Newcastle United around 1990, and John had formed the Magpie Group because the takeover was very different to takeovers today. Because then you had to go out and buy shares from every individual, and there was hundreds of them scattered throughout the country, to buy up enough shares to force yourself into boardroom. Nowadays, you just go to Ashley and do a deal with one guy. You could go now to the 80%ers in Saudis, and if they do a deal, you've got Newcastle United, because you would have control with 80%, regardless of the 10%. So it's very different these days. And it was John Hall was one of the pioneers that changed the way football was run by becoming a single owner of the club, by buying up all the shares. So it took about 2 years to do that. And I was part of that Magpie Group to do all the publicity of the campaign, which was really tough, because to start with, we were hounded because the Newcastle United board were very much against the takeover, obviously. Now, during those days, I was obviously privy to an awful lot of private thoughts of John and the Magpie Group for when they did take over. And John came to me this particular day and said, look, when we're successful, when the takeover is completed, I'm going to appoint Graham Taylor as the manager. He said, everybody I've talked to and put the name Graham Taylor before them has said, yes, what a great appointment this would be. I was absolutely horrified and said, John, no way can you appoint Graham Taylor. Now, what you've got to remember is at that time, what had attracted John Hall to offer the job, or about to offer the job to Graham Taylor, is that Taylor was at the height of his fame. He had taken over, he had been appointed at Watford after Elton John took over Watford, and I did a big thing with Elton John up here just after he got Taylor, and he was waxing lyrical to me about what the wonderful job Taylor was doing. He took Watford, as you know, through all the divisions, right up to the top division, where they played in the FA Cup final at Wembley, famously Elton John crying in the Royal Box, and were runners up in the first division. So he'd done an incredible job there, which got him the Aston Villa job. At Villa, he'd won them promotion, and they'd finished runners up in the first division. And at the time where John was telling me he was going to go and get him, he was at Aston Villa, but was just about to be offered the England job. He was just about to go to the England job. And John was looking to jump in, head it off, and take the hottest ticket in town. For me, the big difference was that Graham Taylor was a bit like Jack Charlton. He played the long ball game for a start. Everything was a long ball. Get it as quick as you can from the back to the front. Have 8'6" centre forward. He had Riley at Watford, and he played off big centre forwards, and he got results. There's no question he got results that way, and he got results, phenomenal results at Watford, and he got Villa a certain 9/10 of the way up the ladder with the same sort of playing. But the difference is that works at smaller clubs like Watford. It worked at smaller situations for Jack Charlton, who was a manager, had his greatest time with the Republic of Ireland. But he organised exactly the same thing, ball back to front as quickly as you can and attack them. Poor Chippy Brady, who was a wonderful player in the middle of the field, got neck ache through looking up at the ball passing over his head. And he never saw the ball in the middle of the field. It works wonderfully with smaller sides. And the Republic of Ireland were a smaller side internationally. Like when you think of Brazil and Italy and England and Argentina, and it worked there, and it worked for Graham Taylor at Watford. But I thought if he become Newcastle manager, remember Big Jack become Newcastle manager, only lasted a season, and the fans hounded him out because they didn't like the style Newcastle are playing. And I felt the same thing was going to happen. This was before Jack, with Graham Taylor. And I said to him, no, don't do it. And he was quite shocked. And I think initially John was a little bit annoyed that I was sort of urging him not to do, because I think he expected me to be thrilled at what I was being told. But a long time afterwards, when I talked, and you've got to bear in mind that instead of getting the long ball merchant, he got Kevin Keegan, the original entertainer, etc., etc. And he said to me afterwards, Gibbo, that's the best piece of advice I ever got. And it was not to do something. It was not to do something. He said, and you know what it is? He said, a lot of people with me, he said, if I suggest something, they just say I'm right because of who he is. Sir John Hall, multimillionaire, built the Metro Centre. You've got to be right. So everybody nods their head in unison, tells him he's right. Nobody says, no, you could be wrong. And if you remember, once Graham Taylor got the big job, England, but what happened there? Remember the long ball stigma followed him to England. His famous phrase, do I not like that? Remember him sitting on the touchline saying, do I not like that? I mean, he didn't endear himself to anything. Remember during Euro 92, we were beaten 2-1 by Sweden, so failed to reach the semis. And that was when Lineker was his centre forward. And he had a chance in that game to equal or even break Bobby Charlton's all-time England record of 49 goals. And he substituted him. When England needed to win the game and were getting beat by Sweden, he took one of the greatest goal scorers England had ever had off and substituted him during the game. And of course, Lineker never broke the record as a consequence. The Sun, who famously in those days were outrageous, to the Sun national paper, to the point of being cruel, immediately called Graham Taylor turnip head and did a big picture on page 1 of a turnip with Graham's face implanted on. An awful, awful thing to do to an honourable man, regardless of what style of football he played. But that was a narrow escape. Some of the ones that Newcastle might have got, we wish they had got. I honestly feel that was a narrow escape, but it was built on a reputation of, if you just looked at stats, the job he'd done at Watford and Aston Villa suggests that he's the perfect manager, which is obviously what England had done. But when we often talk on my normal podcasts, Andrew, I always say, well, stats are interesting, but they're not everything. And the thing that stats didn't tell you is that he played long ball, not attractive to watch, and fans hated it.
Yeah, a blessing in disguise that Sir John took your advice, John. We're going to talk about a man who I think many people actually, given what he achieved in the game, would have loved to have seen at Newcastle United, and that is Sir Alex Ferguson. Talk that he was offered or was about to be approached to replace Kevin Keegan, who left in the mid-90s, obviously the entertainers era is what everyone mentioned, January 97, when Kevin Keegan finally walked away. I mean, Sir Alex Ferguson replacing him, John, that would have been some appointment, wouldn't it?
I mean, now we're cooking on gas. We're talking about the real deal. There's absolutely no question there. Look at his record at Manchester United. It was absolutely fabulous. Certainly, that would have been a better appointment than Graham Taylor would have been. It come during the years when the combo of Freddie Shepherd and the Halls were running Newcastle. A little bit after John was going out to the main firing line and Douglas was working with Freddie. And a call went through discreetly to Fergie, sounding him out whether he'd be interested. Now, Fergie had always had a soft spot for Newcastle. He's a jock. Newcastle was just over the border. He felt that Newcastle fans, and the common denominator, we said at the beginning of this podcast, why does everybody want to become manager of Newcastle United? And my reply was because of the fan base. And the reason Ferguson even considered it was because of the fan base, that it's so passionate, it's so caring, that the 10,000 will turn out to see the shirts on a washing line blowing in the wind after a game. They care that much. And it's the sleeping giant. It hasn't been done for so long. Be the first to do it. They knock Gray's Monument down and you're on the top. And that's what interested Ferguson. And he sent a word back saying that he was intrigued and interested and what was the possibility. And then, of course, that's his heart talking and his head takes over, and so many things are happening and are about to happen and will continue to happen at Manchester United that, it would be silly to leave. But you flirt with it, you give it serious consideration. At another time, it could well have happened, but at that stage, it was just a step too far. And the funny thing is that his big mate, one of Alex's several big mates in the game, was Bobby Robson, who he adored and who he loved. And that's why Alex come up to the memorial service that was held at Durham in the cathedral and gave a passionate speech about Bobby. And the thing is, yes, Bobby fulfilled all his dreams because his dreams, like McManamy, was as a Geordie, was to manage Newcastle United. But of course, he could have become the Newcastle United manager long before he did. And that was a shame. In my eyes, that was a shame. At the time, after KK, Sir John was very, very keen to make it Bobby Robson as the new manager to replace KK. And he actually flew out to Barcelona, which is where Bobby was at the time, to speak to Bobby about becoming the Newcastle United manager. Tug on his heartstrings about Bob's dad being a Newcastle United fan. Hughie Gallagher was his dad's hero. He used to take Bobby on the terraces to watch Newcastle play, etc., etc. And by the end of that conversation, and this was after Bobby's first season of Barcelona, when he'd won 3 trophies and he had Ronaldo, the original one, the Brazilian centre-forward, as his centre-forward. He'd signed him from Holland, where he was playing. And Bobby actually shook hands that night with Sir John and said, "It's a done deal. I'll come home." John came home as a consequence of that and was actually thrilled a bit. What happened in reality was that Bobby then found out that Douglas Hall and Freddie Shep were at the same time talking to Kenny Dalglish about becoming Newcastle United manager. Kenny Dalglish, who would have had and did have the backing of Alan Shearer, because he'd been Shearer's manager when Blackburn won the First Division Championship. And so Shearer was behind that train of thought. When Bobby found out that Newcastle directors were actually, one part of the board was talking to one and one was talking to him, he realised, he thought, what chance have I got? If it's a split board when I start, and if anything goes wrong, what chance have I got? Now, he is a loyal man as well, and he had this uncomfortable feeling about walking out on Barcelona, but was willing to do it because it was Newcastle. But once, and this never come out, and he just stuck by that, the loyalty thing with Barcelona. But the truth of the matter was that Bobby knew or found out that Newcastle, 2 other Newcastle guys were talking to Dalglish, and he thought, No. And you know what was ironic and sad about that was that John said, I phoned him up a few days later about the arrangements for him to come here. He said, and all of a sudden when I spoke to him, his voice was different. He was a bit more strained. He was a bit more detached. He was a bit not as excited as he had been when I left him. And he came out with, I want to be loyal to Barcelona. The ironic thing is that he didn't know, Bobby, at that time, Barcelona were already talking to Louis van Gaal about taking over at Barcelona and decided to do it. They decided to do it immediately. They were going to have him eventually, but Bobby had only had one season in charge. And what happened? They brought Van Gaal in and kicked Bobby upstairs as director of football, which effectively was chief scout. And the second year of his 2-year contract was seen out doing that. And that wasn't what Bobby wanted. Bobby wanted to be at the coalface, looking after football where it mattered. And so, ironically, he showed some loyalty to Barcelona, who didn't show any loyalty to him, appointed Van Gaal behind his back. He should have come to Newcastle. And I always think, Andrew, what might have been if Bobby Robson had followed Kevin Keegan, because Kevin Keegan had got us to 2 successive runners-up places in the Premier League. The second one, Dalglish, was on the tin by the end of the season, but the first half of the season had been Keegan, and Dalglish just let that team run on to the end of the season and they finished second. But if Robson, we had fallen right down the pecking order again, and Robson had to start from a side fighting relegation in the top division to take with the third top in the Champions League, etc. If he had followed on from where Keegan had us, might we have been established as the sort of club we want to become now? Might we have been established then as that? And I think the answer is yes, we would have been.
Yeah, that is the key question. That's probably the sliding doors moment that I think everyone thinks about if Bobby had come when first approached. But given that we started that kind of segment talking about Sir Alex Ferguson, John, if it was a straight choice between Alex Ferguson to replace Kevin Keegan or Sir Bobby Robson to replace Kevin Keegan, no issues about money, about contracts, both of them were up for it, who would you be choosing at that time?
Oh, it's an awful thing. Because why it's an awful thing is because I adored Bobby. And I adored Bobby at that time. And I worked with Bobby. And I knew he had a heart of gold. And I knew how much he cared about Newcastle. Alex Ferguson has never been a man that you warm to easily if you're an outsider, because he's very abrasive and he's very much, he's a bit like Brian Clough. When Brian Clough's always, is one step away from jabbing a finger in your face. Alex is a bit like that. If you took your heart and everything out of it and you didn't know either, you'd have to go for Ferguson because he was doing it. Bobby was threatening to do it. Bobby almost won lots of things at Ipswich. Bobby almost won Italia 90 with England when they got to the semi-finals. As the farthest they'd got away outside of our homeland ever in a World Cup. And he almost won the title, the European, with Barcelona. And he almost won things at Newcastle, but didn't. But he was a wonderful manager and took clubs beyond their dreams and everything. But if you're hard-nosed, you've got to say Ferguson if you're hard-nosed. If you've got a heart as opposed to a hard nose, then you would go with Bobby and say the ride was wonderful and I enjoyed it anyway and we were so close. But you can't stand up and say that we had wonderful times under Kevin Keegan and Bobby Robson, but we're won now. Now, if we're obsessed now with winning things, Ferguson's your man, isn't he? And the next man I'm going to talk about is your man as well.
It certainly is. And I guess just at that time, given the fact that he just won the Premier League as well the season before, beating Newcastle 2-8, probably Sir Alex Ferguson, I think, would be the choice of many, even though it might be through gritted teeth. But yes, John, you are right. The next man we're going to talk about is someone you've just mentioned there, Brian Clough. And before I let you get on with it, I just want to read you a headline
Yeah,
that you may well have written. You were definitely probably involved in. It's from the
yeah.
Journal back in 1981, and it reads, "What a load of rubbish! Brian Clough, old big head himself, twice a European Cup winning manager on his way to Newcastle. Crazy, a joke." That was the headline on the front of the Journal back in 1981. Do you remember that? Was that you? Or was that a colleague, perhaps?
What was that? What's a joke? What was you referring to there?
Brian Clough becoming Newcastle United manager.
Oh, no, that's typical Cloughy, because he had the great chance of becoming Newcastle United manager. But Clough, you know what all managers do, quite rightly, is if the job doesn't come up, they deny there was ever a chance and try to pour cold water on it. I mean, and that's the most natural thing in the world to do. I mean, what he did on that BBC archive thing that's going out of me being on with Doug Weatherall, another journalist from up here, against Laurie McMenemy and Cloughy, was trying to say that the North East wasn't a hotbed of football because we won now. Now, they are both North East people who adore the North East. We're looking for jobs in the North East. Cloughy played for Middlesbrough and Sunderland and managed Hartlepool in the North East. But we're quite willing to say, oh, it's not out by their football, it's hopeless, sort of thing. I mean, the background with Cloughy is very, very interesting to what happened. In the early 80s, I used to do an awful lot of talk-ins with top people around the Northeast in social clubs. And the incredible thing in those days is that managers, albeit with a pull, the Northeast having a pull on them because this was the area they came from, top managers would come from elsewhere in the country up just to do a night in a social club or a working men's club in the Northeast, talking football with their own people. I mean, Bobby Robson used to come up from Ipswich to do gigs with me up here and travel back the same night, by the way. And that's some journey back to Ipswich. Cloughy used to come up from Derby or Nottingham to do exactly the same thing. And I remember him coming up from Derby, picking me up in Newcastle in a car, and he had one of the Derby directors driving him as chauffeur. Can you believe that? A Derby director acting as chauffeur to his manager, who's going to make a few quid doing a gig up in the Northeast talking about football. And he drove him to Newcastle, picked me up in Newcastle, and we went up to see houses to do a gig. He travelled from Derby to see houses to do a gig and sell out. We came out at 11 o'clock from the gig at Sea Houses. We went in the local chippy, and Cloughy went up to the counter and got 3 bags of fish and chips, one for me, one for the Derby director who was his chauffeur, and one for him. And they sat in the car, dropped me off at Newcastle, and they went back down to Derby. It was absolutely incredible. But we were doing a lot of talkings with Cloughy up in the Northeast at the time. And it was and he always wanted to do the unexpected, like that headline, you know. Manager Newcastle, are you joking? I mean, he did whatever was not expected of him. I mean, I always remember a gig that we did at the gates at Civic Centre, me and Cloughy, just me and Cloughy, on stage. And all the dignitaries were there from the gates of council and the mayor with a chain on, and up in a private room upstairs, a proper meal of cold chicken and sandwiches and everything, waiting for Cloughy for half time in this do. He came on, we went on stage, we did the first half. At the end of the first half, when we were due upstairs to meet the local dignitaries and have the food and everything, he refused to come off stage. He said, no, I'm going to sit on stage, he said, and sign any autographs and have any photos taken for any fans that want it. And everybody rushed up on the stage, did that. I went upstairs to have me chicken leg and whatever. And the dignitaries were past themselves. But Cloughy, knowing full well that's upstairs, decided to stay on stage. There was a lot of little girls going to go on stage, and I'm talking about little schoolgirls, about 6 or 8, who were going to dance and do a little routine on stage while we were upstairs. They were in tears at the side of the stage because they couldn't get on because Clough wouldn't leave the stage. And in the second half, somebody asked him a question about centre forwards, and he said, because he was a great centre forward that played for England and whatever, and he said, "Don't ask me about centre forwards. I know nothing about them. I signed Fashanu for £1 million," he said, which he did do with Forest. Then he launched a tirade at the audience about allowing Thatcher to become Prime Minister because he was a Labour guy in a Labour area where it's a Labour council and all the MPs up here are Labour, and he got stuck in to the audience for voting in Thatcher, who was a Conservative. I guess there would be about 3 people in the whole audience that had ever voted Conservative in their life, but he did the exact opposite all the time. But the 2 lads who were in the Magpie group with me were called John Woff and Peter Ratcliffe. John Woff was the guy that went round and did all the deals for buying the shares, and Peter was involved in the same thing. Still friends of mine to this day. And they were at my talking with Clough, and they got to know Clough well, and they were Clough disciples, which is why they were there, as so many people were. And they brought up in the interval, when we weren't on stage, they brought up to Clough about would he ever consider becoming Newcastle United manager. Now, as I say, he was born in Middlesbrough, played for Middlesbrough and Sunderland, managed Hartlepool, and he was definitely interested. And he said, I would definitely be interested under the right circumstances. Again, because it's a big club. That's why he was interested in Leeds, who were a big club at the time. Levy had made them a big club. And with respect, he made Forest and Derby a big club. They weren't before that, and they weren't after that either, because he made them a big club, but he never had a job with a big club, apart from Leeds, 40-odd days. Never got the England job. Newcastle would have represented a big club. He made clubs big. He didn't get big club jobs. And that's why he was interested in Newcastle United. And incidentally, there was a further approach made to him when Stan Seymour Jr. was the chairman of Newcastle United. An approach was made to Clough as well. And it was almost like one of those things like Ferguson. 2 outstanding managers who were absolutely tempted. They would never, under any other circumstances, have been interested in a club in Newcastle United's position if it wasn't Newcastle United. But with the fan base they had, they pulled at their heartstrings. You thought, this is a job that could suit me. And believe you me, because I was there, regardless of anything Clough might say, I was there at the time and heard it out his own mouth how much he was interested in the Newcastle United job and what more could we find out, etc. And John and Peter and myself made approaches to the Newcastle board, who were both fascinated by the idea, Clough, and terrified, Andrew, because he's that sort of guy. You know what I mean? He's confrontational. He's not going to give you an easy ride as a board, I can tell you that. There's no question about that. And so, he's tempted because we're a good club. They're tempted because he's a good manager. But he thinks, should I leave where I am? And they think, he'd be a handful. He'd be a handful. And so don't quite do it. And so it doesn't come off.
I'm right in thinking the approach, I think it was 1981, as intrigued and as interested Clough was, it was actually his missus who kind of talked him out of it because she didn't want to uproot the kids to hindsight.
You're absolutely right. And by the way, that shows how much he wasn't supposed to be interested. He actually talked it over with his missus, who wasn't with us when we had the conversation with him. And, the hope was that, we never thought that his missus mightn't fancy it. Because, as you know, Nigel Clough was born in Sunderland because that's where Clough happened to be playing when Nigel came into our world. So, coming back home to Newcastle didn't seem too much like a big deal. But, you get settled in an area, and managers' wives don't like moving about. These days they don't, do they? When managers get jobs, they go and live in little apartments somewhere on Tyneside or something. I mean, Eddie Howe's the exception, and good on him, bringing the whole family up here and settling down into. That's what used to happen donkeys years ago. Now happens no more, because wives won't move around the country, and they won't move kids around the country, and so they stay at a base, and the managers go up into the luxurious hotels or apartments. But yes, it's true that she just didn't fancy it whatsoever, and you can see it from her point of view.
You certainly can. I mean, that would have been some partnership, Newcastle United and Clough. He would go on to win the League Cup twice with Forest in the late 80s.
Yeah.
Of course, winning the European Cup twice prior to the approach from Newcastle United, and the First Division as well. What a manager! And I mean, what a job he probably would have done at Newcastle. We're going to move on to the next name in the list. This man approached by Newcastle twice under two separate owners. We'll fly forward to I think it's around about 2004, potentially the first approach. But the name is Terry Venables. Sadly, recently died, no longer with us. A gentleman of the game, England's Barcelona, like Sir Bobby as well, Leeds, Middlesbrough, among some of the clubs. Tottenham, if I'm not mistaken, or Tottenham, played for Tottenham anyway, a legend in his playing days there. Talk to us about Terry Venables then, because approached twice, and it shows maybe the pedigree that he had.
And believe you me, that was another miss, Andrew, because he is a wonderful, wonderful manager. Was a wonderful, wonderful manager. Think of him with Barcelona, where he achieved so much with Barcelona, and of course with England in Euro '96, when another Geordie legend, Alan Shearer, best coach he's worked with. Alan Shearer had not scored an England goal for 2 years before Euro '96. Can you imagine that? I know they don't play every week like clubs, but nonetheless. And Terry Venables took him to one side before Euro '96 and said, Alan, you worry in the build-up. Don't get pressure. Don't start twitching. You will be my centre forward throughout this tournament until we go out of it or win it. And he ended up with the Golden Boot, Shearer, as the top goal scorer in the whole of Euro '96. And Shearer has always said, another Newcastle legend, Gaza, had him at Spurs and with England. You remember in England, remember that wonderful goal against the Scots at Wembley when Gaza brought it down on one foot, flicked it over Henry's head onto the other foot and volleyed it in. They both said quite unique coach, capable of doing so much. Yeah, he appeared like Del Boy. He appeared like Jack the Lad. Very intelligent, very clever man, though. Under no circumstances underestimate that. And one so far ahead of everyone else in terms of tactics and what he was capable of doing. It was Freddie Shepherd who was first in and agreed terms with him in 2004 after Bobby Robson left. Again, a missed opportunity when you think about it. He actually agreed terms with him. However, what was wrong then, again, it's timing, and so often it is timing, isn't it? What was wrong then was that Terry was waiting for a hip operation, which was sort of holding him back in his mobility and not making it easy to automatically take a big job like Newcastle United. And so Freddie Shepherd turned away wanting somebody instant, etc., and we got Graham Souness. And that didn't work out, obviously.
Yeah, well, I don't know as well, John. I mean, I read for the research of this pod as well that the plan was that Terry Venables would come in on a short-term kind of basis, and Alan Shearer would be groomed to become the next Newcastle United manager.
Yeah.
That's not something that Terry Venables kind of agreed with. He wanted a longer term thing at Newcastle United. I think the quote that I read was he didn't want to, a bit like Clough in many ways, he didn't want to uproot to then find himself,
absolutely.
not needed 2 years down the line. And I guess you can understand it from Terry's point of view as well. I mean, you wouldn't want to move your family up to the Tyneside if within a season you're going to be kicked out the door for Alan Shearer, as much of a legend as he is. From Terry's point of view, that's not ideal at all.
Yeah, I mean, if it had worked the other way, and Newcastle just say, Venables, you come up here and do A, B, C, and give him a longer contract, he would have automatically groomed Shearer to be his successor, because he'd done so much with Shearer during Euro 96, and they both loved each other. And if it hadn't been foisted upon him in that way, I think that would have happened as natural progression, but it didn't. I mean, the second approach was more farcical because it was in 2008 and it was made by Mike Ashley after Kevin Keegan quit. We tend to forget that Kevin Keegan come back to Newcastle as a manager for such a short space of time with Ashley, who, of course, threat KK abysmally, as he did Shearer when he was caretaker, two huge Newcastle United legends. But this, when I say it was unfortunate we didn't get Terry Venables initially, it was very fortunate for Venables that he didn't take the Ashley job in 2008, because the way that he threat KK and the way that he threat Shearer. And of course, who did we get instead of Terry Venables? Joe Kinnear. Now, that was an appointment and a half, wasn't it? I mean, that is going from the top of the tree to the end. I mean, Joe, bless him, because there was points of Joe that you could like as a person, and I got to know him when he was up here, not as a manager, but as a manager so far out of his depth it was untrue. And but was a typical Ashley appointment of people. Who do I know in London? I know Alan Pardew, I know Joe Kinnear. I love Spurs. Let's go and get Joe Kinnear.
And I mean, reading again up on it, Terry Venables was offered a game-by-game deal. I mean, have you heard of anything so ludicrous? Not a game-by-game deal until we get a new manager, just a game-by-game deal and see how you get on,
yes.
Which sums up Newcastle United under Mike Ashley. It was Dennis Wise leading the negotiations at that time as well. So there's a trip down memory lane we don't want to go down, because we'll call it nightmare lane, John. But
yeah, well, I mean, you think about how Newcastle were operating at that time. The reason KK walked out on Newcastle United was that he was told who Newcastle were going to sign, and when he said he didn't know anything about this fella, he was told to watch him on YouTube. This guy was going to become the centre forward to play for Newcastle United under Keegan, and Keegan was told to look him up on YouTube. Keegan, the man that signed Cole, that signed Ginola, that signed Albert, who signed Ferdinand, who signed Shearer, and by the way, he did sign them, not the board. The board supported him, but he picked them. And he was told to watch the signing by Ashley. He told to watch the signing on YouTube, and it was a fait accompli anyway.
Yeah, just utterly bizarre. And we've got a quote here actually from Terry Venables from back in, I think it was 2014, something like that, writing in a column for one of the Nationals. And he said, "I always wanted to manage Newcastle United. I always thought, whether they were doing well or not, that I could get my teeth into this, that I could take them where they wanted." And it seemed like for him, of all the jobs that was nearly his, that was probably the one that he wanted the most.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? We've said that so many people, non-Geordies, you would expect Bobby Robson to want it, you would expect Laurie McMenemy to want it, but you've got people like Terry Venables saying that, and Brian Clough and Alex Ferguson considering, because of the fan base, because there's a great belief that, if you get it right in Newcastle, as I say, they take Lord Grey off the top of the monument and they put you on. And that still applies to today. That still applies now. Eddie, if you want to win the first trophy in a long time, if you want to get in the Champions League, and if you want to eventually win the Premier League and the Champions League, you will be the greatest thing that's ever happened in this city since Grey was made Prime Minister. And that's what waits for people up here, and it's still waiting to this day. And that's what attracted all these big names. And the next guy, the final guy that we're talking about, was a big name in management as well.
Certainly was. And for younger listeners, maybe listening or watching and saying, you guys seem really disappointed Terry Venables didn't get the Newcastle United job. Well, you just have to look back at his honours list as a manager to see why maybe out of all the names that we've mentioned, he's probably the one wins La Liga with Barcelona, the Copa de Liga, Copa del Rey runner-up, wins the FA Cup with Tottenham.
He played the game, Andrew, the way we, Geordies, like Newcastle United to play the game. He played it with a expansive football. He played it with huge intelligence. I mean, I went down and covered every England game during Euro 96 at Wembley. And it's when the song come out, football's coming home, etc. And we beat Holland, who were the chop team, with Shearer scoring. We scored 4 goals. That was the ultimate. The atmosphere in that ground during Euro 96 is something I've never heard before or since at England games. And it was totally generated by Terry Venables. And he was absolutely, think of everything Barcelona has done of recent times, and he's absolutely adored in Barcelona, and there was multiple tears flowing in that city when he died recently. He would have fit like a glove. All right, he's a Cockney, etc., but so was Malcolm MacDonald, and he did a fair job at Newcastle. He would have fit Newcastle brilliantly.
He certainly would have done. And on to the final name then, John. A name that all the listeners will know of, a bright, bubbly character, Harry Redknapp. So let's talk about this one. 2008 comes after the sacking of
Sam Allardyce.
Big Sam Allardyce, yes. Let's get into it then. Harry Redknapp.
Yeah, I mean, again, his background in the way he played football at Spurs and various other places, Jamie's dad. It was another fanciful idea of Mike Ashley. He always had these, shall we go and appoint Harry Redknapp? Shall we go and appoint Terry Venables? No, we'll appoint Joe Kinnear and we'll appoint Steve McClaren. So reality and what was attempted become 2 different things. But I mean, this was at the time where Harry was managing Portsmouth and got them to win the FA Cup, and they had big Crouchy down at Portsmouth. To get Portsmouth to win the FA Cup, you're doing well. And Harry was that sort of good manager. He always lived in Bournemouth, even when he was manager of Spurs. He had a car and a chauffeur that drove him from Bournemouth every day up to Tottenham for training and drove him down to Bournemouth every night. He lived at Bournemouth all his life and didn't want to leave Bournemouth. But Ashley approached him on the sacking of Allardyce when he still had his big ideas and thought he could make them work with the gift of the gab, approached Harry Redknapp and offered him, can you believe, we talk about Spurs, him being in a car with a chauffeur going from Bournemouth to London every day to training and back at night. Ashley's deal offered to Redknapp was that he would put a private jet at his disposal, which would leave Bournemouth at 7 o'clock in the morning and ferry him up to Newcastle and take him back at 5 o'clock at night to Bournemouth to be with his family at night. Every day that God sends. And that tempted Harry because, there was always the smile on the face of and the word behind the scenes in football that he got a nosebleed if he went north of Watford. Harry, because he was very much the Cockney boy who had made his home in Bournemouth and his reputation at Bournemouth initially, and then become very well known to Eddie during his rise at Bournemouth from player to manager. But the reason he was going to take the Newcastle job, apart from the fact that Newcastle were Newcastle, was that this private jet was going to be on for him. And then he thought, quite rightly, when he had time to simmer down and think about it, he had second thoughts and said to the missus and said to Ashley, look, if I lose a few at Newcastle, Geordies will go off the nut about me flying up and down every day instead of being committed to living in Newcastle. And so because it'll get out, and so I'll take a hammering. And in fact, there was always speculation and adversity, wasn't there, when Michael Owen was playing for Newcastle and he was taking a helicopter to his home in Cheshire. I'm not meaning necessarily every day that God sent, but quite regularly. And Newcastle fans never took to Michael Owen, partly for that, partly for a lot of other reasons, like being a yard short of pace and being very reluctant to be at Newcastle because he wanted to be at Liverpool again. But there is that thing about, will they accept me when it comes out that I can't get out the town quick enough and don't want to live in Newcastle. I want to live on the south coast. So it didn't happen, and a shame. But I think I'm sorry we didn't get Venables. With Harry, I'm not, because you ought to have Harry. You've got to live here, and Harry would not have lived here under any circumstances. The only reason he was tempted was because of the fan base and because of that daily trip, and he could still live in Bournemouth. You can't manage Newcastle from Bournemouth.
Yeah,
ask Eddie. He brought his family up from Bournemouth quick enough, didn't he?
Yeah, you've got to be in the city to get a feel for it. You've got to be able to walk down the street, getting a pint of milk, and then even if you're wrapped up in disguise, still hearing what people are saying and just feeling the atmosphere, win, draw, lose in the city. That's how you get it. That's how you understand how much it means. So totally agree. I mean, I think Harry Redknapp was one of those managers who talked a good game, relatively successful, but I don't know if his reputation was slightly inflated because of his character. I mean, look, a wonderful, bubbly character, as I've said, but I'm not sure he would have brought Newcastle much success. The question I want to finish on, John, and you've kind of alluded to it already, but if you could have picked one of all those names I've just mentioned, and whether it be going with your heart or your head, who is the one above all else you would have loved to have seen in the Newcastle United dugout?
I'm going to go against the record books and stats to a certain extent here. Because Fergie won so much, 20-odd trophies. It was ridiculous if you count up the trophies. But I would like to see Clough at Newcastle.
You see, I thought you were going to go for Terry Venables.
No, the three outstanding characters of all three we've talked about are Venables, Clough, and Ferguson. I've just got a feeling about Clough. I mean, he turned a frog into a prince at both Derby and Nottingham Forest. And what might he have done here? And the way he did it, and he did it by book and authority. I mean, Geordies would have loved his. I mean, Ferguson for his record says I'm the number one. Venables for his potential, because he played football so much the right way, and I would have been so keen. But I've always been a Clough disciple. He booked authority. He did everything the wrong way. He took the team for a drink on the team coach before a game into a pub to have a pint. He took his dog training with him in Nottingham Forest. But Nottingham Forest in the second division going to become champions of Europe 2 successive seasons, going to own the League Cup, going to take Derby to the Championship. I mean, I think that is made in heaven. His personality, his desire, his outrageousness Newcastle United passion, fan passion. I think anything could happen. I think anything could happen.
Yes, well, that is what we're at now. It's a what-if moment. It would have been a tremendous time if Clough had indeed taken the job. Would have been entertaining at the very least, and hopefully would have been a successful one. Thank you to John for taking us down memory lane and talking about the managers who very nearly became Newcastle United manager, very nearly became those in the dugout at St James's Park. To you guys watching and listening, please hit subscribe and follow, and head over to chroniclelive.co.uk for all the latest Newcastle United news. And from myself and John, we'll see you guys very soon.